Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Live, India's voice to the world. I'm Lipakshi Khurana, coming up in the next 30 minutes. Ukraine President Zelensky agrees to implement a halt on energy infrastructure attacks, but vows to attack if Moscow violates the term of the ceasefire. Israel extends ground operations in Gaza after deadly airstrikes. USA's bridge proposal on the table to extend the ceasefire and release of hostages. A legal standoff continues in U.S. as White House vows to continue its mass deportation of undocumented migrants while judge warns of consequences. Turkey detains the mayor and President Erdogan's main election rival over graft and terrorism allegations, sparking protest. Fed holds interest rates steady as it waits for Trump economic policy to take hold, sees slower growth, expect 2 cuts coming this year. On to the details. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Wednesday that a halt on energy strikes in the war with Russia could be established quickly, but Ukraine would respond in kind if Moscow violated the terms of the ceasefire. Well, after speaking to U.S. President Donald Trump on Wednesday for the first time since their disastrous Oval Office meet, Zelensky said Kyiv would draw up a list of facilities that could be subject to a partial ceasefire brokered by Washington. That list could include not only energy but also rail and port infrastructure. Zelensky added that Kyiv would be ready to discuss U.S. involvement in modernizing and investing in the nuclear plant if it is returned to Ukraine. Well, Zelensky said he believed Putin would not agree to a full ceasefire while Ukrainian troops remained in Russia's western Kursk region. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine have exchanged 175 prisoners of war each. Russia handed over an additional 22 seriously wounded Ukrainian prisoners. Both sides confirmed. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in a statement on X, described the exchange as one of the largest of its kind. And in the first conversation since an Oval Office shouting match on February 28, Zelensky thanked Trump for U.S. support, and the two leaders agreed that technical teams would meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days. Well, the White House announced that it has moved beyond the previously negotiated U.S.-Ukraine minerals and natural resources deal, shifting its focus to securing peace between Ukraine and Russia. Trump briefed Zelensky on his phone call on Tuesday with Vladimir Putin, in which the Russian president rejected a proposed full 30-day ceasefire sought by Trump. He described his conversation with Trump as positive, very substantive and frank. White House says the talks have moved beyond U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal.
President Zelensky asked for additional air defense systems to protect his civilians, particularly Patriot missile systems, and President Trump agreed to work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe. The two leaders also agreed on a partial ceasefire against energy. Technical teams will meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to discuss broadening the ceasefire to the Black Sea, on the way to a full ceasefire.
Well, the European Council summit will convene on Thursday in Brussels. Heads of state and government of the 27 member states, as well as EU Council President Antonio Costa, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the bloc's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas will participate in the summit. Several critical topics reflecting current geopolitical and economic priorities are expected to be discussed during the two-day summit. The agenda includes discussions on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, with a particular focus on the bloc's continued support for Ukraine, especially amid heightened tensions and the need for security guarantees. Well, the summit comes after a busy period of diplomacy, with the EU leaders aiming to respond to shifting transatlantic dynamics and regional challenges. European defence will also be a key point, with leaders likely to explore ways to boost capabilities and address funding, possibly in light of a forthcoming EU white paper on defence. And the Israeli military has resumed ground operations in the central and southern Gaza Strip, and its operations extended Israel's control over the Netzarim corridor, which bisects Gaza. The Israeli military operations were a focused maneuver aimed at creating a partial buffer zone between the north and the south of the enclave. The renewed ground operations came a day after more than 400 Palestinians were killed in airstrikes in one of the deadliest episodes since the beginning of the conflict in October 2023, shattering a ceasefire that has largely held since January. While the U.S. State Department blamed Hamas for the resumption of hostilities and said there was still a U.S.-crafted bridge proposal on the table to extend the ceasefire and bring about the release of hostages held by the group in Gaza. The renewed violence was condemned by some Western nations, including France and Germany, as well as Qatar and Egypt, which had been acting as mediators in the ceasefire negotiations. Also, the White House on Wednesday stepped up attacks on a federal judge that ordered flights carrying alleged Venezuelan gang members to be turned around. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, in a press briefing, said the administration does not have any additional flights to El Salvador carrying alleged gang members planned after U.S. District Court Judge James Boasberg tried to intervene with a verbal order as flights were in the air on Saturday. The press secretary bashed Judge Boasberg, describing him as liberal activist attempting to stifle President Trump's immigration agenda.
For additional air defense systems to protect his civilians, particularly Patriot missile systems, and President Trump agreed to work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe. The two leaders also agreed on a partial ceasefire against energy. Technical teams will meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to discuss broadening the ceasefire to the Black Sea on the way to a full ceasefire.
Well, the U.S. judge warns that the Trump administration could face consequences if it violated a judge's order temporarily blocking the deportation of hundreds of Venezuelan migrants. Even the judge gave the government more time to elaborate on the expulsions. Washington-based U.S. District Judge James Boasberg said the administration could choose to invoke the state secrets doctrine, which protects sensitive national security information from being disclosed in civil litigation, and explain why it was doing so rather than provide details on deportation flights. And in a remarkable escalation of the ongoing tensions between the White House and the judiciary, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts issued a rare public rebuke of President Donald Trump on Tuesday, slamming his call for the impeachment of a federal judge as a threat to the independence of the U.S. judicial system. DD India's Antra Sinha gets you more in this report.
U.S. President Donald Trump's judiciary feud intensifies as Supreme Court Justice John Roberts publicly scolds the president. Roberts' rare rebuke comes after Trump called for the impeachment of a federal judge. The extraordinary move marks a significant escalation in Trump's conflict with the judiciary, sparking concerns over the independence of the U.S. judicial system. Roberts said in a brief statement that for more than 2 centuries it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. Roberts' extraordinary rebuke of the president came after Trump called for the impeachment of District Judge James Boasberg, who ordered the suspension over the weekend of deportation flights of alleged illegal migrants. Across the U.S., judicial orders have put a halt, even if temporarily, in many cases to Trump's executive orders. A list of latest orders that have stopped the implementation of Trump's order include: a federal judge ordered an immediate halt to the shutdown of the main U.S. aid agency by Elon Musk's Doge. District Court Judge Theodore Chuang said that dismantlement of the US Agency for International Development likely violated the Constitution in multiple ways. They argued that Musk needed to be confirmed by the Senate in order to exercise his authority. The judge agreed. Another judge recently ordered the rehiring of thousands of probationary workers in multiple agencies who had been fired by Musk's dodge. In another case, a US federal judge suspended the Trump administration's ban on transgender people serving in the military. Judge Anna C. Reyes cited the principle of equality to give ruling. The judge referred the US Declaration of Independence, which states that all humans are created equal. Tuesday's order was in a case brought by a group of transgender people to challenge Trump's latest executive order. US federal judge Tanya Chutkan temporarily blocked the US Environmental Protection Agency from recovering grant funds issued as part of a $20 billion climate funding program that Republican President Donald Trump's administration has moved to terminate. US District Judge Tanya Chutkan in Washington issued a temporary restraining order halting the EPA's termination of 3 environmental non-profit groups' grant agreements and barring Citibank from disbursing grant funding held at the bank in their accounts. Chutkan also said it appeared that the EPA failed to take the legally required steps necessary to terminate grants. Antra Sinha for DD India.
Well, thousands of protesters took to the streets of Istanbul on Thursday following the arrest of the city's mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. The opposition figure is seen as a key rival to President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Hundreds chanted anti-government slogans, with police using pepper spray to disperse protesters when they tried to push their way through a police formation. Well, several roads had been closed, some social media platforms were restricted, and a 4-day demonstration ban was put into place in an attempt to thwart protest. However, despite the ban, many gathered outside the Istanbul's police headquarters, the city hall, and outside the headquarters of İmamoğlu's Republican People's Party. Meanwhile, EU chief Ursula von der Leyen has said Wednesday the detention of Istanbul mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu was deeply concerning.
Mayor is deeply concerning. As a Council of Europe member that Turkey is and an EU candidate country, Turkey must uphold the democratic values.
Well, Pope Francis has suspended the use of an oxygen mask as the clinical condition of the pontiff was improving after more than 1 month in the hospital. The Vatican said on Wednesday that the Pope is no longer using mechanical ventilation for help in breathing at night, and his doctors believe he will continue to improve. The Vatican press office said that Pope Francis's pneumonia has not been eliminated but was under control. Pope Francis has been in Rome's Gemelli Hospital since February 14, suffering from pneumonia in both lungs, but the Vatican has reported recent progress after earlier worries that his life could be at risk. The Vatican released the first image of Francis in hospital on Sunday, showing him praying in a chapel. And the first commercial charter flight has taken off from Pokhara International Airport in Nepal to Chengdu in China's Sichuan province. This inaugural flight marks a significant achievement, coming 2 years after the airport's inauguration in 2023. The flight is part of the Pokhara Visit Year 2025 celebrations and commemorates 70 years of Nepal-China diplomatic relations. A delegation of 126 tourism entrepreneurs, media personnel and officials from Pokhara Metropolitan City and Pokhara Visit Year 2025 Performance Committee were on board, aiming to promote tourism between the two nations. And a jury in North Dakota has found Greenpeace liable for hundreds of millions of dollars in damages in a case brought by a U.S. pipeline operator that accused the group of orchestrating a campaign of violence and defamation. Well, Greenpeace must pay a Texas-based pipeline company nearly $667 million in damages for the environmental advocacy group's role in 2016-2017 protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. The verdict included damages of defamation, trespassing and conspiracy. The jury awarded more than $400 million in punitive damages, which are intended to punish defendants for their conduct. While Greenpeace denied wrongdoing and called the case an attack on free speech rights, the group's lawyers said they would appeal the verdict. Construction of the pipeline was met with fierce protest by environmental and tribal advocacy groups who said the project would poison local water supply and exacerbate climate change. The project began in 2016 and was completed the following year. The pipeline transports roughly 40% of the oil produced in North Dakota's Buchanan region. Well, the Canadian Pacific of 1940 steam train that took soldiers and supplies to England's south coast during World War II returned to service on Wednesday, taking on board volunteers who spent 14 years reconditioning it and relatives of those who built it. The Canadian Pacific set off from the market town of Alresford in southeast England for an inaugural journey to nearby Alton, marking the completion of a restoration project that began in 2011. Well, the train was named after the Canadian Pacific shipping lines that crossed the Atlantic during the war to deliver military and civilian supplies to Britain. Many such vessels were destroyed or damaged by the Nazis. After World War II, the train was used for regular passenger services to and from the coast, often for holidaymakers. It was last taken out of service in 2008 and is now due to be revived for tourist trips on the Heritage Watercress line. And still to come in this edition of DD India Live. 10th Indian, Latin America and Caribbean Conclave in New Delhi today with EM Dr. S. Shankar leading key discussion. Stock rise as Federal Reserve keeps interest rates unchanged. Gold hits a record high and Nasdaq leads with 1.4% gain. And the second edition of the Khelo India Para Games kick off in the national capital on Thursday. Welcome back. You're watching DD India Live. I'm Vipakshi Khurana, and moving on, the ongoing 10th edition of India, Latin America and Caribbean Conclave in New Delhi, focusing on enhancing India's trade relations with the Latin American and Caribbean region, will witness the presence of India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Shankar. The minister will attend the special plenary session discussing the topic of advancing economic alliances for collaborative growth. The conclave features 15 overseas ministers and around 300 international business delegates from the LAC region. Well, Slovakia looks forward to hosting India's President Draupadi Murmu soon. Visiting Slovakian Foreign Minister Đurađ Blanner says President Murmu's visit can be expected to further boost the bilateral ties. The minister spoke exclusively to DD India's Ramesh Ramachandram in New Delhi.
The last visit we have on a high level, it was a visit of my counterpart, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Jaishankar. It was in 2022. So we are really looking forward to visit of Her Excellency President of India at the beginning of April, so with the business delegation as well. So this will be the very important part of our strengthening tie between our countries.
Well, you can watch the full interview at 8:30 p.m. 1500 GMT on Thursday. And India has dispatched machinery worth $1 million to Suriname as part of its development partnership to support the growth of the country's passion fruit industry and strengthen bilateral economic cooperation. While India's External Affairs Ministry embassy in a social media post highlighted that the grant would contribute to the development of the country's marcosa or the passion fruit industry. Prior to that, India in November 2024 sent the first consignment of about 425 MT of food grains and other edible items to Suriname for its social welfare program. And moving on, India's President Draupadi Murmu will inaugurate Udyam Utsav at Rashtrapati Bhavan on Thursday, marking a significant initiative to celebrate and empower India's micro, small and medium enterprises. Well organized by the Ministry of MSME, the 10-day event will highlight the contributions of small businesses, artisans and entrepreneurs across the country. The event will reinforce the government's commitment to foster grassroots economic growth. The event will feature 7 thematic pavilions, each highlighting a different segment of MSMEs, including heritage and handicrafts, organic and agro-based products, green technologies, women entrepreneurs, tribal enterprises, and khadi and village industries. And the Federal Reserve kept its benchmark interest rate unchanged on Wednesday and signaled that it still expects to cut rates twice this year. The U.S. Federal Reserve maintained its policy rate between 4.25% and 4.50%. Federal Reserve officials maintained their projection of 2 interest rate reductions in 2025, whilst revising their growth estimates downwards for 2025 and increasing their inflation predictions following the Trump administration's implementation of tariffs. While the U.S. Central Bank officials suggested they continue to expect a reduction in borrowing cost by 50 basis points before year end, considering the anticipated economic slowdown. Also expected is the eventual decline in inflation rates. Additionally, they reduced the U.S. GDP growth forecast for the current year from 2.1% to 1.7%, alongside predictions of a marginally higher unemployment rate by the end of this year. Well, U.S. Fed Chair Jerome Powell said the economic activity was looking strong, but the surveys conducted by the central bank showed weak sentiments, partly because of tariffs. He also said that the forecasts have considered the tariff retaliation by other countries on U.S.
Let me say that it is going to be very difficult to have a precise assessment of how much of inflation is coming from tariffs and from other, and that's already the case. You may have seen that goods inflation moved up pretty significantly in the first 2 months of the year. Trying to track that back to actual tariff increases, given what was tariffed and what was not, very, very challenging. So some of it, the answer is clearly some of it. A good part of it is coming from tariffs, but we'll be working, and so will other forecasters, to try to find the best possible way to separate non-tariff inflation from tariff inflation.
Well, the stocks were high on Wednesday after the Federal Reserve left interest rates unchanged in its latest policy announcement and maintained its forecast for lower rates later in 2025. Gold flipped positive, touching a record high, and U.S. Treasury yields paired gains. All 3 major U.S. stock indexes gained upward momentum after the announcement. The Dow Jones rose 383.32 points, the S&P gained 60.63 points, and the Nasdaq rose 246.67 points. European stocks closed higher, notching their 4th consecutive session of gains. U.S. Treasury yields paired their early advance after policymakers indicated they anticipate the Fed funds target rate will be reduced by 50 basis points this year. Crude prices gained ground after U.S. data showed an inventory drawdown, while markets kept an eye on the limited Russia-Ukraine ceasefire. Also, gold prices turned positive and touched a record high in the wake of the Fed's lowered economic projections. And on to some sports news now. The second edition of Khelo India Para Games is set to begin in the national capital on Thursday. These games will be held in 6 disciplines, including para-athletics, para-archery and para-badminton. The opening ceremony will be held at the Indira Gandhi Stadium on Thursday evening in the presence of over 1,300 athletes and 350 support staff. The tournament will be streamed on the YouTube page of Prasar Bharati Sports and will also be available on live broadcast on DD channels. And two-time Olympic medalist PV Sindhu suffered an early exit from the women's single event at the Swiss Open 2025. Former world champion Sindhu succumbed to world number 31 Julie Jacobson in a contest that lasted 61 minutes. The defeat marks the Indian star shuttler's third consecutive first-round exit of the year. Meanwhile, India's women doubles pair of Gayatri Gopichand and Teresa Jolly advanced into the second round of the badminton tournament. The Indian duo comfortably defeated Aline Muller and Kelly Van Buiten to move to the next round, where they will face Germany's Celine Hubst and Amelie Lehmann. All right, that's all for this edition of DD India Live. But let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. For those on the go, you can get all the latest news and updates from India and across the world in the DD India mobile app. The app is available on both Android and iOS platforms. Scan the QR code on the screen to download now. Well, we'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Vipakshi Khurana from all of us here in Delhi. Thanks for watching DD India Live.